My name is Rebecca. I am 34 years old, and my mother-in-law slapped my 15-year-old son at Thanksgiving dinner. She screamed that he was not real family and ordered him to get out. He hit the floor in front of the entire extended family, but no one dared speak. They acted as if nothing had happened. I did not cry. I simply looked at her and said 6 words that destroyed her entirely. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your child from toxic relatives. The sound of shattering crystal cut through the polite murmur of the dining room like a gunshot. It was Thanksgiving evening, and the air inside Beatrice's Connecticut mansion was already thick with the suffocating scent of expensive perfume roasted turkey and generations of unearned arrogance. The dining room was a grand monument to old money featuring towering vaulted ceilings, heavy velvet drapes that blocked out the November cold, and an antique Persian rug that Beatrice loved to remind everyone cost more than a luxury car. My son Leo, who had been sitting quietly at the edge of the sprawling mahogany table, had simply shifted his heavy wooden chair to give a passing server more room. His elbow caught the edge of a towering crystal water goblet. The heavy glass tipped over, falling in slow motion, before exploding against the hard edge of a silver serving tray. A dark, jagged pool of red wine splashed outward, raining down directly onto that priceless Persian rug. The entire room went dead silent. The clinking of silver forks stopped instantly. Dozens of wealthy guests, extended family members, and arrogant business associates turned their heads in unison to stare at my 15-year-old boy. Leo froze his eyes wide with the immediate panic of a child who knows he has stepped into a dangerous minefield. He dropped to his knees, frantically grabbing clean linen napkins from the table, his hands trembling violently as he tried to dab at the spreading red stain on the expensive fibers. I started to rise from my chair, my maternal instinct screaming to shield him from the intense judgment burning in the eyes of the people around us. But before I could even take a full step toward my son, the matriarch of the family made her move. Beatrice lunged across the space separating the head of the table from where Leo knelt. She moved with a sudden vicious speed that betrayed her polished country club exterior. Without a single word of warning, she raised her hand and struck him. The slap echoed loudly, a sharp, violent crack that seemed to bounce off the vaulted ceilings and ring in my ears. The force of the blow caught Leo completely off guard, knocking him backward. He hit the hardwood floor beside the ruined rug, his cheek instantly blooming into an angry, bright red handprint. I felt the air leave my lungs. For a fraction of a second, the universe seemed to stand completely still. I waited for anyone to gasp to intervene to show a shred of basic human decency. Instead, the elite guests simply averted their eyes, pretending to inspect their perfectly manicured fingernails or the delicate gold rims of their water glasses. Beatrice stood towering over my son, her chest heaving, her perfectly styled hair trembling with unbridled rage. She pointed a manicured finger directly at his face and let out a scream that carried all the venom she had been harboring for years. "You are street trash my son picked up!" She shrieked, her voice echoing harshly off the walls. "You are not real family. You will never be real family. Get out of my house." I turned my head slowly to look at my husband Colin, the man who had vowed to protect us, the man who was supposed to be a father figure to the boy I had brought into our marriage. Colin was leaning back in his custom-upholstered dining chair, lazily swirling a glass of aged bourbon. He did not look at Leo on the floor. He did not look at his mother hovering over my child with violence in her eyes. He simply took a slow sip of his amber drink, let out an exhausted sigh, and looked at me with an expression of mild annoyance. "Mom is right, Rebecca," he said, his tone entirely flat and devoid of any empathy. "Control your kid. He ruined the aesthetic." That single callous sentence told the entire story of our marriage, a story of a spineless enabler who would gladly watch a child be abused rather than cause a ripple in his mother's perfect pond. It confirmed what Beatrice had whispered in the shadows for years. They viewed Leo as nothing more than the unfortunate baggage of a teenage pregnancy, a mistake I had made at 19 that Colin had generously agreed to tolerate. In their eyes, Colin was the wealthy savior who had rescued a struggling single mother, and Leo and I were supposed to exist in a state of eternal silent gratitude. They thought my past made me weak. They thought the trailer park I grew up in defined my entire existence. They were so blinded by their own privilege that they completely missed the powerful woman I had actually become. I did not cry. There was no hysteria, no screaming match, no pleading for respect. The time for begging this family for basic human decency had passed long ago. A profound, icy calm washed over me, numbing every nerve in my body and sharpening my focus until everything in the room faded into the background, leaving only Beatrice and me. I stepped around my chair and walked deliberately toward my son. I knelt beside Leo, placing a gentle hand on his shaking shoulder. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears, holding his hand against his reddened cheek. I pulled him to his feet, my grip firm and reassuring. I took one of the pristine white linen napkins from the table and slowly, methodically wiped a stray drop of spilled wine from the back of my hand. The silence in the room was absolute heavy, with the expectation that I would grab my son and flee into the night defeated and humiliated, exactly as Beatrice intended. Instead, I tossed the stained napkin onto the ruined Persian rug. I took a step forward, closing the distance between me and my mother-in-law. She lifted her chin, her eyes flashing with triumphant cruelty, fully expecting an apology or a tearful retreat. I looked dead into her eyes, refusing to blink, refusing to let her look away. I let the silence stretch for one more agonizing second before I opened my mouth and delivered the ultimate blow. I bought your foreclosed mansion today. The 6 words hung in the air, sharp and heavy as an executioner's blade. Beatrice froze. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The triumphant sneer melted off her face, replaced by a blank mask of total incomprehension. She blinked once, twice, staring at me, as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Her hands, which had been clenched in righteous fury just moments before, suddenly went slack. The expensive porcelain dessert plate she had been holding slipped from her fingers. It hit the hardwood floor, shattering into dozens of jagged white pieces that scattered across the room. The entire dining room froze in absolute silence. The suffocating silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The shattered pieces of porcelain at Beatrice's feet serving as the only physical evidence that the world had just turned upside down. Then slowly the shock on my mother-in-law's face began to contort back into a mask of arrogant disdain. Beatrice threw her head back and let out a shrill, mocking laugh that grated against my ears. The sound was desperate and hollow, a pathetic attempt to regain control of a room that was rapidly slipping from her grasp. She looked around at her wealthy friends, waving her hand dismissively in my direction, inviting them to join in her manufactured amusement. "You," she gasped, wiping a fake tear of mirth from her eye. "You bought this house, a girl who had a baby at 19 in some filthy trailer park. Please, Rebecca, do not embarrass yourself any further. You cannot even afford the crystal wine glasses on this table, let alone a multi-million-dollar estate. You are absolutely delusional." A few of the guests chuckled nervously, eager to side with the woman they believed still held all the power. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt, fully buying into the narrative Beatrice had spent years constructing. In their eyes, I was just a hysterical, ungrateful daughter-in-law, having a mental breakdown during the holiday dinner. They expected me to shrink back, to apologize, to crumble under the weight of her relentless gaslighting. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea what I had spent the last decade building while they were busy attending charity galas and playing golf. I did not say a word in response to her insults. I calmly reached down and unzipped the sleek leather designer bag hanging from my shoulder. The smooth sound of the zipper seemed incredibly loud in the hushed room. I reached inside and retrieved a thick, heavily bound stack of legal documents. The papers were crisp, official, and stamped with the unmistakable heavy red ink of the state's largest commercial bank. I held the stack up for a brief moment, letting the heavy silence return to the room, before I tossed the documents onto the table. They landed with a heavy thud, sliding directly into the puddle of spilled red wine that Leo had desperately tried to clean up. "That is the certified deed of transfer," I said, my voice steady and carrying effortlessly across the large room, "signed by the bank executives at 8 o'clock this morning. You see, Beatrice, while you were busy telling everyone I was just a helpless charity case, you never bothered to ask what I actually do for a living. I am a distressed asset liquidator. I specialize in buying up bad debts from major financial institutions, packaging them, and restructuring the properties. And your particular debt was brought to my desk 3 weeks ago." I took a step closer, watching the smug smile finally slide off her face for good. "You have not paid your mortgage in 14 months. You have been drowning in debt, taking out secret loans to maintain this ridiculous lifestyle, and hiding the foreclosure notices from everyone in this room. The bank officially seized the property yesterday. I bought it from them in a closed liquidation sale this morning. I own the walls, the roof, and the very floor you are standing on." The murmurs in the dining room erupted into shocked gasps. The wealthy guests who had been chuckling at me moments before now stared at Beatrice with wide, horrified eyes. In their elite circles, financial ruin was the ultimate sin, a contagious disease they all desperately wanted to avoid. The realization that their grand hostess had been serving them roasted turkey in a house she no longer owned sent a wave of visible panic through the crowd. Beatrice's face turned a mottled, sickly shade of purple. She looked down at the wine-stained documents, her hands trembling uncontrollably, unable to process the total destruction of her carefully curated social standing. Suddenly, Colin slammed his glass of bourbon onto the table, finally jolted out of his lazy apathy. He pushed his chair back violently and marched toward me, his face twisted in ugly defensive rage. "Rebecca, you are out of your mind," he shouted, pointing a threatening finger at my face. "You are going to pick up those fake papers, apologize to my mother right now, and take your kid out of here before I do something you will regret." He lunged forward, attempting to physically snatch the documents off the table to rip them apart. I took a swift, calculated step back, entirely unfazed by his aggression. "The deed is already filed with the county clerk, Colin," I said, my tone as cold as winter ice. "Tearing up a piece of paper will not change the fact that this is my house now." I turned my attention back to the woman who had just struck my child. I pointed toward the grand entryway of the dining room. "You have exactly 10 minutes to pack a bag, Beatrice. 10 minutes to gather whatever personal items you can carry. After that, you are officially trespassing on my private property, and I will have you forcibly removed." Beatrice let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream. The veins in her neck bulged against her pearl necklace as the reality of her eviction crashed down upon her. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, but her rich friends were already stepping away, distancing themselves from the sinking ship. Driven by sheer desperate panic, she plunged her shaking hand into her pocket and pulled out her smartphone. She began jabbing at the screen with frantic, uncoordinated movements. "You malicious, lying tramp!" she shrieked, pressing the phone to her ear. "I am not leaving my home. I am calling the police." She began screaming into the receiver the moment the dispatcher answered, her voice echoing wildly through the mansion. "Help me! Send officers immediately! There is a violent intruder in my house. She is threatening my family and trying to assault me. Send the police right now." I stood my ground, wrapping a protective arm around Leo's shoulders as he watched the chaotic scene unfold. He was trembling slightly against my side, still processing the physical shock of the slap and the emotional whiplash of the last 5 minutes, but I held him tight, anchoring him to the reality that we were no longer victims. Beatrice continued to wail into the phone, playing the role of the terrified, fragile victim to absolute perfection, weeping dramatic tears for the emergency dispatcher on the other end of the line. Let her call them. I thought, a grim, unbreakable sense of satisfaction settling deep into my bones as I watched her dig her own grave. The police were exactly what I needed to finish this. The moment the dispatcher disconnected the call, Beatrice dropped her phone onto the polished mahogany table. Her posture immediately wilted. She collapsed heavily into a velvet-upholstered chair, burying her face in her hands, and let out a series of loud theatrical sobs. The remaining guests, the country club elite, who had not already fled the dining room in a panic, rushed to surround her. They patted her trembling shoulders, casting venomous, judgmental glares in my direction. Beatrice peered through her fingers, ensuring she had a captive audience, before launching into a masterclass of manipulation. She wailed to her wealthy friends about how she had opened her heart and her home to a troubled teenage mother, how she had graciously accepted a girl from a trailer park into their prestigious lineage, and this psychotic episode was her reward. She spun a desperate narrative on the spot, loudly claiming that I had suffered a severe mental breakdown and forged those bank documents out of pure ungrateful spite. Colin did not try to comfort his weeping mother. Instead, he marched aggressively across the room, closing the distance until he was towering over me. His face was flushed with a dark, ugly anger, his breath reeking of expensive bourbon and raw panic. He invaded my personal space, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me into submission, a cowardly tactic he had relied on for years behind closed doors. He reached out his fingers, digging harshly into my upper arm, trying to physically drag me away from the table. I yanked my arm away with enough force to make him stumble, my eyes daring him to try touching me again. He leaned down, his voice dropping to a vicious, threatening hiss so the surrounding guests could not hear his actual words. "You are going to lose everything, Rebecca," he snarled, a thick blue vein pulsing visibly in his forehead. "The police are going to walk through those doors and lock you in a concrete cell. Do you know what happens to kids when their mother gets arrested for elder abuse and corporate fraud? Child Services will take him away tonight. They will put your bastard kid in the system, and I will not lift a single finger to stop them." Colin framed his cruelty as a favor, glancing nervously at the large front windows facing the street. "Take Leo and run out the back door right now. Leave the fake deed on the table and disappear. If you run, I will tell the cops it was a misunderstanding. I will handle my mother. Just get out of this house before they put you in handcuffs and ruin your life forever." I did not break eye contact. I kept one arm firmly wrapped around Leo, who was standing tall and resilient beside me. "Step away from me, Colin," I said, my voice dangerously calm and entirely devoid of fear. "I am not running anywhere. This is my property, and you are currently standing on my floor." The sharp, piercing wail of police sirens suddenly cut through the freezing November night air. The sound grew rapidly louder, echoing violently off the manicured lawns and stone facades of the elite Connecticut neighborhood. As the noise signaled the impending arrival of law enforcement, the dining room descended into a frantic, panicked frenzy. Wealthy guests scrambled to gather their designer coats and expensive purses, terrified of being associated with a messy public police incident. Yet amidst the absolute chaos of the room, one person remained perfectly serenely still. Jasmine sat at the far end of the sprawling dining table. As Derek's wife and a brilliant, high-powered corporate lawyer, she was the only African-American woman in this suffocatingly white, arrogant room. For years, Beatrice had made Jasmine's life a living hell through a relentless, calculated campaign of subtle, deniable microaggressions. Beatrice would routinely hand Jasmine the coats of arriving guests, pretending with a fake apologetic smile that she mistook her for the hired help. She would loudly ask at crowded family dinners if Jasmine's natural hair was considered workplace appropriate at a real respectable law firm. Beatrice loved to imply to her country club friends that Jasmine only earned her prestigious legal degrees through affirmative action quotas, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that Jasmine had graduated at the absolute top of her class. Through every insult, every slight, and every passive-aggressive comment, Jasmine had always smiled politely, keeping her composure, playing a brilliant strategic long game. Right now, she took a slow, deliberate sip of her dark Cabernet. She watched Beatrice weeping and performing her fragile victim routine with a look of absolute icy satisfaction. Jasmine did not flinch as the sirens grew deafeningly loud outside the front windows. She simply shifted her gaze across the chaotic dining room and caught my eye. A subtle, sharp nod passed between us. The trap we had spent months meticulously building in the shadows was finally snapping shut. Heavy, authoritative boots pounded against the stone steps of the front porch. The massive oak double doors burst open with a loud, violent crash. 4 uniformed police officers stormed into the grand entryway and fanned out into the dining room, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts, their eyes scanning the room for an active threat. The flashing red and blue lights from their cruisers parked outside pierced through the large bay windows, casting erratic, frantic shadows over the shattered porcelain and the spilled red wine soaking deep into the Persian rug. Beatrice instantly launched herself forward, throwing her body toward the lead officer with theatrical desperation. She clutched his uniform sleeve with trembling hands, fresh tears streaming down her perfectly contoured, aging face. She pointed a manicured, shaking finger straight at my chest. "That woman is a violent intruder!" Beatrice cried out, her voice cracking with manufactured, breathless terror. "She attacked my family. She stormed into my private home, assaulted my teenage grandson, and now she is threatening to steal my property with forged bank papers. I demand you arrest her right this second for elder abuse, trespassing, and felony fraud. Please, officer, I am absolutely terrified for my life. She is completely unhinged." The officers, deeply conditioned to protect the wealthy, prominent homeowners of this exclusive zip code, without question, immediately turned their hard, suspicious gazes on me. They saw a hysterical, wealthy older woman pointing at a younger woman standing defiantly in the center of the wreckage. 2 officers stepped forward instantly, their expressions hardening into professional, unforgiving resolve. They unclipped the heavy metal handcuffs from their belts, advancing toward me with purposeful, intimidating strides. "Ma'am, keep your hands exactly where we can see them," the taller officer commanded, his stern voice echoing loudly in the suddenly quiet room. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back, right now." Leo flinched beside me, his breath hitching sharply in his throat at the terrifying sight of the approaching police, but I stood completely still, my head held high. I did not raise my hands. I did not defend myself. I simply waited. Before the officer could close the final 2 feet between us, a heavy wooden dining chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. Jasmine stood up, her tall frame commanding instant, undeniable authority. "Officers, do not touch my client." Jasmine moved with the lethal grace of a predator that had patiently waited in the tall grass for years. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her presence alone commanded the space. She reached into her tailored blazer, retrieving a sleek leather card holder, and smoothly presented her credentials to the lead officer. "I am Jasmine Vance, senior partner at Sterling and Hayes, and I represent the legal owner of this estate." The officer paused, his hand hovering over his handcuffs, his eyes darting from Jasmine's elite corporate badge to the furious, sputtering Beatrice. Jasmine did not give him a chance to second-guess her authority. She stepped smoothly between the police and my son, completely shielding Leo with her own body. She handed the officer a thick-bound legal dossier. "Beatrice has been lying to you, officer. My client is not an intruder. She is the sole lawful owner of this property. Inside that folder, you will find the authenticated foreclosure purchase agreement, the executed transfer of deed, and the county clerk's official stamp recorded at precisely 8 o'clock this morning." Beatrice's hands began to shake violently. She pointed a trembling finger at Jasmine, her voice screeching in panic. "Do not listen to her. She is my daughter-in-law. She only got her law degree because of affirmative action quotas. She is conspiring with this trailer park trash to steal my home. Arrest them both right now." Jasmine slowly turned her head to look at Beatrice. For years, Jasmine had endured those exact same racist microaggressions. She had smiled politely through every backhanded compliment about her hair, every condescending remark about her background, and every subtle attempt to make her feel like she did not belong in this wealthy, privileged family. Now Jasmine was the one holding the executioner's axe. "Affirmative action did not buy your foreclosed debt," Beatrice, Jasmine said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, icy whisper. "Rebecca bought it with cold, hard cash. and I processed the legal transfer. You defaulted on your mortgage 14 months ago. The bank seized the asset yesterday. Rebecca's liquidation firm acquired it this morning. You are currently trespassing on her private property. The lead officer carefully reviewed the documents, flipping through the pages with a small flashlight. The heavy, oppressive silence in the dining room returned, broken only by the sound of the freezing rain lashing against the large bay windows outside. Every wealthy guest, every arrogant business associate, and every extended family member held their collective breath, watching the unshakable matriarch of their elite circle rapidly unravel. The officer snapped the folder shut and handed it back to Jasmine. His entire demeanor shifted instantly. The aggressive, suspicious posture he had directed at me vanished, replaced by a rigid, uncomfortable professionalism. He turned to face a hyperventilating Beatrice. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat and authoritative, "this documentation is ironclad. The deed is fully verified. This is her property. You need to vacate the premises immediately." Beatrice staggered backward as if she had been physically struck. "No. No, that is impossible. This is my house. I hosted charity galas here. I built this family. You cannot do this to me. I am Beatrice. You cannot throw me out into the street." The officer stepped forward, his hand resting firmly on his utility belt. "I am not going to ask you again, ma'am. You have exactly 5 minutes to gather your essential personal belongings, or we will have to escort you off the property in handcuffs." The humiliation that washed over the dining room was absolute and visceral. The elite guests, the very people Beatrice had spent decades trying to impress and dominate physically, recoiled from her. They grabbed their designer coats and hurried toward the exit, desperately avoiding eye contact with the disgraced woman. Whispers rippled through the fleeing crowd like a toxic wave. Smartphones discreetly captured photos and videos of the mighty society queen being treated like a common squatter. Beatrice scrambled frantically toward the antique silver serving trays, her hands wildly grabbing at a priceless silver candlestick. Jasmine stepped forward, effortlessly blocking her path. The legal seizure includes all fixtures, furnishings, and assets within the property boundary to cover your outstanding debts. Jasmine stated, her tone entirely devoid of pity. "You may take your clothing and your medication. Nothing else." A bewildered catering staff member, unsure of what else to do, nervously handed Beatrice a heavy-duty black plastic trash bag. Beatrice stared at the plastic bag in absolute horror before frantically shoving 2 mink coats and a handful of designer shoes inside. Tears of pure, unadulterated shame streamed down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. 2 police officers flanked her, grabbing her by the elbows. They marched her forcefully through the grand entryway, out the heavy oak double doors, and directly into the freezing, torrential November rain. Beatrice stumbled down the wet stone steps, clutching her black trash bag tightly to her chest. Her pathetic, desperate sobs completely swallowed by the howling winter wind. Seeing his mother thrown into the street like common garbage, Colin entirely lost whatever fragile grip he had on his sanity. He charged at me, his face twisted in rabid, terrifying fury, spittle flying from his lips as he screamed, "You are dead. Do you hear me, Rebecca? You are absolutely dead. My money funded your little business. My family gave you everything. I will call my legal team the second I wake up. I will have my lawyers freeze all your assets by Monday morning. I will drown you in litigation until you and that bastard kid are living in a cardboard box on the side of the highway." I did not flinch. I did not step back or show even a fraction of an inch of weakness. I calmly reached up and adjusted the collar of my designer coat, brushing a piece of invisible lint from my shoulder with an air of total indifference. I looked dead into the eyes of the pathetic, spineless man I had been married to for over a decade. "Are you sure about that, Colin?" By 9 o'clock on Friday morning, the freezing rain of Thanksgiving had given way to a harsh, blinding sunlight that reflected off the glass skyscrapers of the downtown financial district. Colin stormed through the heavy revolving doors of his high-priced legal firm, moving with the erratic, aggressive energy of a man accustomed to buying his way out of every inconvenience. He bypassed the receptionist entirely, marching straight into the corner office of his senior attorney. He threw his tailored cashmere coat onto a leather sofa and began pacing the length of the room. He was unbelievably arrogant, his chest puffed out as he bragged loudly about his master plan to completely crush me. He demanded that his lawyer draft the most aggressive legal maneuvers possible, vowing to leave me and Leo out on the streets with nothing but the clothes on our backs. He paced in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, spinning a delusional narrative where he was the victim of a manipulative gold digger. He claimed that his family name gave me legitimacy, that his inherent wealth was the only reason I had ever succeeded at anything, and that it was finally time to put me back in my place. His attorney, a man who charged $1,000 an hour to protect the fragile egos of wealthy heirs, immediately got to work. He filed an emergency injunction to freeze every single corporate account tied to my distressed asset liquidation firm. Colin stood over his shoulder, a vicious smirk playing on his lips as he watched the documents print. He operated under the arrogant assumption that because we were legally married, my business automatically qualified as a shared marital asset. He firmly believed that his status as a born wealthy man, a son of elite society, would easily squash a self-made woman who had dared to step out of line. He signed the injunction with a heavy flourish of his expensive fountain pen, already picturing the moment I would come crawling back to him, begging for access to my own money to feed my son. He instructed his lawyer to demand the immediate surrender of the Connecticut mansion back to Beatrice, convinced that financial starvation would force my rapid and total surrender. 2 hours later, Jasmine and I walked into the mahogany-paneled mediation room. We moved in perfect synchronization, radiating a calm, terrifying silence. Colin was already seated at the massive conference table, leaning far back in his chair with his ankles crossed, exuding absolute smugness. His lawyer sat beside him, wearing a matching expression of predatory confidence. Before I even pulled out a chair to sit down, Colin's lawyer slid the freshly stamped asset freeze injunction across the polished wood. The heavy paper stopped directly in front of me. The lawyer folded his hands, offering a patronizing smile, and announced that all financial arteries to my firm had been legally severed. He demanded that I sign over the deed to Beatrice's house immediately, or they would begin the process of bankrupting my company before the banks closed for the weekend. Colin let out a short, arrogant laugh, waiting for the reality of my supposed ruin to sink in. He waited for the tears, the panic, the desperate apologies. Jasmine did not even look down at the legal threat resting on the table. Her posture remained impeccably straight, her expression entirely unbothered. She slowly reached into her sleek leather briefcase and retrieved a single yellowed document. It was 10 years old, the edges slightly stiff with age. She held it by the corner, lifting it up for Colin's lawyer to see before sliding it smoothly across the mahogany table until it rested directly on top of their emergency injunction. Her voice was sharp, cutting through Colin's smug satisfaction like a scalpel. "Did you forget what your mother forced Rebecca to sign?" The document lying on the table was an ironclad, merciless prenuptial agreement. 10 years ago in a sterile office exactly like this one, Beatrice had cornered me. She had shoved that very contract into my face, her eyes narrowed with absolute disgust, loudly declaring to a room full of lawyers that I was nothing but a trashy gold digger hunting for a free ride. She was completely convinced that my only goal in life was to drain the precious family coffers. To prove her wrong, to protect my own pride, I had signed the document without demanding a single alteration or a single dime. The clauses Beatrice had demanded were draconian, specifically engineered to build an impenetrable wall between the old money and the new wife. But in her desperate, paranoid attempt to ensure I would leave the marriage exactly as poor as I entered it, Beatrice had insisted on a very specific clause. The prenup explicitly stated that any business enterprise, corporation, or financial asset created, developed, or acquired by either party during the course of the marriage would remain 100% separate, untouchable property. Colin's lawyer picked up the yellowed document, his eyes scanning the densely typed paragraphs. As he read the specific clauses regarding corporate entities, the arrogant, predatory smirk completely vanished from his face. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly and pale. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting from the prenuptial agreement to Colin, pure disbelief written across his features. He leaned over, whispering frantically into Colin's ear, explaining the catastrophic reality of the situation. The emergency injunction they had just filed was entirely worthless. The very weapon Beatrice had viciously designed to keep me poor had completely shielded my multi-million-dollar liquidation empire from her son. The prenuptial agreement legally severed Colin from my firm, blocking him from touching a single cent of the wealth I had built with my own 2 hands. Colin snatched the aged document from his lawyer's trembling hands. His eyes wildly darted across the page, reading the signature his own mother had forced upon me a decade ago. Total panic began to crack his composed exterior. The realization that he had absolutely no legal claim to my assets hit him like a physical blow. But Colin was a lifelong narcissist, fundamentally incapable of accepting defeat. He immediately pivoted, scrambling to deploy his ultimate safety net. He threw the document back onto the table and jumped to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "Fine," he shouted, his voice echoing in the tense mediation room. "Keep your pathetic little debt collection business. I do not need a single penny of your trashy money. I have my $5 million family trust fund. I have generations of wealth standing behind me. I will use every dollar of that fund to drown you in legal fees. I will drag this divorce out in the courts for years until your business collapses, and you are begging me for mercy on your knees." I did not flinch at his screaming. I remained perfectly still, watching the veins bulge in his neck. I leaned forward slowly, resting my elbows on the edge of the polished mahogany table. I began methodically tapping my manicured nails against the hard wood, the rhythmic clicking sound amplifying the sudden tension in the room. I looked up at him, my expression completely void of whatever love or respect I had once held for him. "What trust fund, Colin?" Jasmine's voice was perfectly level, yet it echoed in the sterile mediation room like a gavel striking wood. Colin tried to laugh, a weak sputtering sound that died in his throat as Jasmine unlatched her second, significantly thicker leather portfolio. She did not hand the documents to his lawyer. She slid them directly to Colin. They were certified bank statements, heavily stamped and meticulously highlighted in bright yellow ink. I watched the arrogant flush completely drain from Colin's face, replaced by a sickly, chalky white. "For the past 6 months, while you were busy playing the victim and telling your mother I was a gold digger, Jasmine and I hired a forensic accountant," I said, keeping my voice as sharp as glass. "We followed every single wire transfer, every hidden ledger, and every withdrawal you made over the last 2 years." Colin stared at the top sheet, his hands trembling so violently that the heavy paper rattled against the mahogany table. His lawyer leaned over to look, his brow furrowing as he read the impossibly long string of zeros printed at the bottom of the page. "The $5 million trust fund your grandfather left you is gone, Colin," I continued, leaning back in my leather chair and steepling my fingers. "It has been completely empty for 24 months. You drained the entire account." His lawyer pulled the stack of papers toward himself, rapidly flipping through the pages. The lawyer's face shifted from predatory confidence to absolute horror. The exposure was undeniable and legally disastrous. The documents detailed hundreds of wire transfers to offshore accounts, shell corporations, and cryptocurrency wallets tied directly to massive underground sports betting rings. Colin had not just lost a few $1,000s on a bad football game. He had systematically gambled away $5 million of generational wealth on high-stakes illegal bets, desperately trying to chase his mounting losses until there was absolutely nothing left. He had gambled away his legacy on a smartphone while sitting on our couch complaining that I worked too much. Colin stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room. He looked at his lawyer, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for an excuse, a legal loophole, any lifeline to save him from the reality of his own catastrophic actions. But his lawyer physically pushed his chair back from the table, looking at Colin with pure, unadulterated disgust. The lawyer realized in real time that his client had blatantly lied to him, bringing him into a high-stakes mediation room with absolutely no leverage, zero assets, and a massive trail of financial liability. "But losing your trust fund was not the worst part, was it?" I said, ensuring my voice commanded the full attention of the room. "When the trust ran dry, you still had debts to pay. Dangerous debts to dangerous people who do not care about your country club membership. So you needed a new immediate source of capital." Colin gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. "Stop," he pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Rebecca, please stop right now." I ignored his begging completely. I pulled a secondary folder from my bag and dropped it onto the table with a heavy thud. "You forged your mother's signature on a power of attorney and took out massive high-interest secret loans against her Connecticut mansion. You used her fully paid-off property as collateral to save your own skin from the bookies you owed money to. You are the exact reason Beatrice defaulted. You are the direct reason her house went into foreclosure. I did not steal your mother's home, Colin. You handed it to the commercial bank on a silver platter to pay off your gambling debts, and you let her blame me for it." The silence in the room was suffocating. Colin was completely destroyed, stripped of his fake wealth, and exposed as the sole architect of his own family's ruin. He slumped down in his chair defeated, assuming the execution was finally over. But I was not finished. "But gambling is not your only expensive hobby, is it, Colin?" I asked softly. I reached into my bag one last time and pulled out a glossy, high-definition photograph. I tossed it onto the center of the table, letting it slide perfectly until it rested right in front of his face. The photograph showed Colin standing on the sprawling balcony of a luxury Miami beachfront condo. His arm was wrapped tightly around a 22-year-old Instagram model wearing a designer bikini. They were drinking expensive champagne, looking out over the turquoise ocean, living a billionaire lifestyle on stolen money. The condo was breathtaking, and the diamond jewelry dripping from the young woman's neck was unmistakable. Colin let out a choked, desperate gasp. He lunged for the photo, trying to flip it over to hide the evidence, but his lawyer had already seen enough. I looked at the lawyer, my tone shifting to absolute legal precision. "Colin used our joint marital credit cards and my company's vendor accounts to fund his mistress's lifestyle," I explained, laying out the final nail in his coffin. "He funneled over $300,000 into fake consulting invoices to pay for her luxury condo, her designer clothes, and their romantic weekend getaways. He committed direct financial fraud against his own wife, and he used a registered corporate account to do it." The lawyer immediately closed his briefcase with a loud snap and stood up. He looked down at Colin with utter contempt, recognizing a sinking ship when he saw one. "I cannot and will not represent you in a divorce case involving active corporate fraud, illegal gambling rings, and forged power of attorney documents," the lawyer stated coldly. "You are entirely on your own." He turned on his heel and walked out of the mediation room without looking back, the heavy glass door clicking shut behind him. Colin broke down completely. The arrogant, untouchable air was gone, replaced by a sobbing, pathetic shell of a man. He dropped to his knees right there on the expensive office carpet, crawling across the floor toward my chair. He grabbed the hem of my skirt with shaking hands, his face contorted in absolute desperation. "Rebecca, please," he wept, his voice thick with tears and mucus. "Do not do this to me. Do not ruin my life. They will put me in federal prison for the fraud. I was stupid. I was stressed. But I still love you. I have always loved you. We can fix this together. Just give me one more chance to make it right." I looked down at the man who had stood by and casually sipped bourbon while watching his mother violently slap my teenage son across the face. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger, just a profound, cleansing emptiness. I kicked my chair back, forcing his grasping hands to let go of my skirt, and walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling window. The office was on the 30th floor, offering a perfect, unobstructed view of the busy downtown street below. I stood looking down at the heavy city traffic, completely ignoring the pathetic sounds of his weeping behind me. "You should come look at this, Colin," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on the street below. "It is a beautiful view. He sniffled loudly, slowly pulling his trembling body up from the floor. He stumbled over to the window, his eyes red and swollen desperately, hoping I was offering him a moment of grace or a chance for redemption. He pressed his hands against the cold glass and looked down to exactly where I was pointing. Parked illegally on the street directly in front of the legal building was Colin's absolute pride and joy. A custom midnight black Porsche 911 that he meticulously polished and obsessed over every single weekend to project an image of extreme wealth. Backing up to the front bumper of the expensive sports car with its amber lights flashing brightly was a heavy-duty commercial tow truck. Colin gasped, his breath fogging the window pane. "What are they doing?" He panicked, his voice rising in a frantic pitch. "That is my car. They are scratching the custom paint." "Actually, it is not your car," I corrected calmly, admiring the brutal efficiency of the tow truck driver as he secured the heavy metal chains. The Porsche was leased entirely under my holding company's name for tax purposes. Since you are no longer an authorized driver or a trusted partner for my firm, I canceled the lease agreement at 9 o'clock this morning. They are repossessing the vehicle right now. Colin let out a raw, guttural scream of absolute fury. He turned away from the window, sprinting wildly out of the mediation room and sprinting down the long hallway, desperately hoping to catch the elevator and stop the tow truck before his final symbol of wealth and status was dragged away into the city traffic. As he vanished through the heavy office doors, his smartphone, which he had left sitting unattended on the mahogany conference table, began to vibrate wildly. The screen lit up brightly, displaying Beatrice's name in large letters. I walked over to the table and picked up the vibrating device. I swiped the screen to answer the call and pressed the phone to my ear, remaining perfectly silent, waiting for her to speak first. "Do not worry, Colin," Beatrice hissed over the line, her voice vibrating with a toxic, venomous energy. "I know you are dealing with the lawyers trying to save us, but I have a brilliant plan. I am hosting the Oak Ridge Charity Gala tonight. All the most important, wealthiest people in the entire state will be there. I am going to stand on that stage and tell everyone exactly what that trailer park trash did to me. I am going to completely destroy Rebecca's reputation forever. She will never be able to show her face in this town again." The flickering neon light buzzing outside the cheap motel window cast a sickly green glow over the stained floral bedspread. Beatrice sat perfectly rigid on the edge of the sagging mattress, surrounded by the few designer coats she had managed to shove into a plastic trash bag before being escorted off her property. The contrast between her luxurious garments and the peeling wallpaper of the roadside motel room was stark and pathetic. Yet Beatrice refused to surrender to the reality of her total financial ruin. She gripped her smartphone tightly, treating the device like a lifeline. She was a woman who had spent decades weaponizing her social status, and she was not about to let a self-made liquidator strip her of her crown without launching a scorched earth counterattack. She scrolled rapidly through her contact list, bypassing her family members, and going straight for the most powerful connections she had left. She dialed the private number of the Oak Ridge Country Club president. When he answered, Beatrice instantly slipped into the performance of a lifetime. She let her voice tremble perfectly, sounding like a frail, terrified woman who had just survived a horrific ordeal. She claimed she was the victim of a highly sophisticated, targeted financial crime. She told the president that her ungrateful, deeply disturbed daughter-in-law had suffered a psychotic break, forged a series of complex banking documents, and illegally seized her family estate while she was utterly defenseless. She pleaded for the club to host an emergency charity gala that very weekend, framing the event as a desperate fundraiser to protect vulnerable seniors from predatory financial abuse. The president, completely blinded by Beatrice's long-standing status and his own ingrained respect for generations of old money privilege, agreed without a single moment of hesitation. Armed with a prestigious venue, Beatrice spent the next 48 hours executing a vicious, calculated whisper campaign. She systematically called the wives of every hedge fund manager, real estate developer, and bank executive in her extensive network. She spun a terrifying fabricated web of lies designed to ignite their deepest insecurities. She described me as a ruthless con artist who had slithered into her noble family from a trashy trailer park, waiting patiently for a decade just to strike. She told them I had physically attacked her during Thanksgiving dinner, throwing her out into the freezing rain with nothing but the clothes on her back. She warned them that if a deceptive con artist like me could steal a heavily guarded family estate, their own massive fortunes were in grave danger. She played entirely on their elite paranoia, using buzzwords that terrified old money circles, throwing around accusations of fraud, forgery, elder abuse, and hostile takeovers. By Friday afternoon, the entire wealthy enclave of Connecticut was buzzing with outraged gossip. The town elite were ready to open their checkbooks to fund Beatrice's legal crusade, eager to see the upstart daughter-in-law put behind bars and restore order to their insulated world. Across town, inside a sleek, ultra-modern penthouse, Derek stood near a marble kitchen island, staring down at a heavy, gold-embossed invitation. It had been hand-delivered by a private courier just moments ago. The elegant calligraphy announced the Beatrice Family Foundation Emergency Gala. Derek ran a frustrated hand over his face, feeling violently torn. He knew his mother was a manipulative narcissist, and he had seen the irrefutable proof of her financial ruin, but the deeply ingrained societal conditioning to protect his family name still clawed at his conscience. Jasmine sat on a plush velvet sofa nearby, holding her own copy of the expensive invitation. She was not conflicted in the slightest. She was clinically analyzing the guest list that Beatrice had arrogantly attached to the back of the card to prove her ongoing social influence. Jasmine's sharp, dark eyes scanned the names of the wealthiest, most powerful investors in the state. She recognized them instantly. These were the exact heavy-hitting venture capitalists and private equity directors that my liquidation firm had been trying to secure networking meetings with for months. A slow, brilliant, predatory smile spread across Jasmine's face. She set her wine glass down on the glass table and picked up her phone. She typed out a rapid, decisive text message and sent it directly to me. The snake is cornered, dressed to kill. Saturday evening arrived with a biting, bitter chill. The Oak Ridge Country Club was a fortress of exclusivity blazing with warm golden light against the dark night sky. Valets rushed to park an endless stream of luxury vehicles, while inside the grand ballroom dripped with crystal chandeliers and elite snobbery. Beatrice stood beneath the largest chandelier, clutching a glass of champagne, surrounded by a thick crowd of sympathetic millionaires. She soaked in their pity and their promised donations, feeling the intoxicating rush of regained power. The string quartet played a soft classical melody in the corner, setting a perfectly refined atmosphere. Then the heavy mahogany double doors of the ballroom swung open with a resounding, undeniable crash. The heavy wooden panels hit the wall, stops freezing every single person in the room. The music abruptly faltered and died. The polite murmurs vanished instantly. Jasmine and I stepped over the threshold and into the blinding light of the ballroom. We were not creeping in the shadows or looking for a quiet corner to hide. We exuded absolute terrifying billionaire energy. I was wearing a breathtaking custom-tailored emerald green silk gown that draped flawlessly over my figure, screaming power, wealth, and total control. Jasmine stood beside me in a stark, sharply cut white crepe dress that highlighted her unapologetic, fierce elegance. Her posture was flawless, radiating the intimidating aura of an elite corporate lawyer who had never lost a case in her entire life. We looked like we owned the entire building. The silence in the room was deafening. Beatrice turned toward the doors, her jaw dropping open. The champagne flute slipped from her numb fingers, shattering against the polished marble floor. She looked as if she had just seen a ghost walk into the room. Beatrice braced herself, her body tensing as she fully expected me to march across the room, cause a massive, embarrassing scene, and give her the perfect excuse to have security drag us out by our hair. She desperately wanted me to act like the unhinged, out-of-control woman she had described in her vicious rumors. But Jasmine and I did not even glance in her direction. We glided effortlessly past the stunned, staring guests, our heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. We walked straight to the premium bar at the far end of the ballroom. We calmly ordered 2 glasses of vintage sparkling water, clinked our glasses together in a silent toast, and then turned our backs to the bar to face the crowd. We immediately began to mingle. I locked eyes with Arthur Sterling, a notoriously ruthless hedge fund manager who was the primary target of Beatrice's fundraising efforts. I walked right up to him, extending my hand with a warm, confident smile. Within 2 minutes, I had completely captivated him. I casually broke down complex distressed asset margins, yield curves, and high-stakes liquidation returns, speaking a highly sophisticated financial language that Beatrice could not even begin to comprehend. Jasmine seamlessly joined the conversation, dropping razor-sharp legal insights about corporate restructuring and tax-exempt property acquisitions. We were systematically dismantling Beatrice's entire donor base, proving to the wealthiest men in the room that we were the smartest, most powerful women they had ever met. The investors were utterly fascinated, eagerly pulling out their gold-embossed business cards to hand to us. From across the ballroom, Beatrice watched her entire strategy crumble into dust in real time. The incredibly wealthy men she had intended to solicit for her legal defense fund were currently laughing, nodding, and exchanging contact information with the very woman she had sworn was a trashy, uneducated con artist. Beatrice realized with mounting horror that I was not just crashing her party. I was actively stealing her most valuable network right in front of her face. A cold, desperate panic seized her chest. She realized she was rapidly losing control of the crowd, and if she did not act immediately, she would lose her last chance at salvation. She violently shoved her way past a bewildered waiter, nearly knocking over a silver tray of expensive appetizers. She stormed aggressively toward the audio-visual control booth at the side of the stage. She waved her arms frantically, demanding the sound technician cut the background music completely. She marched up the carpeted steps onto the main stage and aggressively snatched the wireless microphone from the podium stand. She stepped directly into the center of the stage, right under the blinding glare of the brightest overhead spotlight. She gripped the microphone tightly with both hands, taking a deep, shuddering breath. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing a fresh wave of fake, pathetic tears to spill over her eyelashes, ready to execute her smear campaign and destroy her daughter-in-law in front of the entire town. Beatrice leaned into the microphone, letting a perfectly calibrated trembling breath echo through the massive ballroom. The sound instantly commanded the absolute attention of every hedge fund manager, socialite, and real estate tycoon in the room. She lowered her head, her diamond earrings catching the light as she dramatically wiped an invisible tear from her cheek. "My dearest friends," Beatrice began, her voice cracking with manufactured vulnerability, "I stand before you tonight, not as the proud matriarch you have known for decades, but as a victim. A mother who loved too much and trusted too blindly." She paused, letting the heavy silence amplify her performance. She painted a vivid, entirely fabricated picture of the past. She claimed that 10 years ago, she had opened the doors of her sacred family estate to a troubled, destitute teenage mother who had absolutely nowhere else to turn. She described how she had taken Rebecca in out of the sheer goodness of her heart, offering her a safe haven, a respectable family name, and unconditional love. "I treated her like my own flesh and blood." Beatrice wept, clutching her chest as if physically wounded by the memory. "I gave her child a home. I gave her the capital to start a small business, hoping to teach her the value of honest work and integrate her into our society. And how did she repay my endless charity with the most calculated, vicious betrayal imaginable?" The crowd gasped in unison, completely hooked by the tragic narrative. Beatrice spun a horrifying tale of elder abuse, claiming that I had spent the last decade secretly learning the family's financial vulnerabilities. She accused me of forging highly complex legal documents, manipulating her son into a state of total emotional despair, and illegally seizing her ancestral home while she was entirely helpless to stop it. She described the eviction with horrifying, entirely false details, claiming I had laughed as my hired thugs threw her out into the freezing winter rain, stripping her of her dignity and her sanctuary. She played the role of the devastated, broken dowager to absolute perfection, wrapping her vicious lies in a veneer of maternal heartbreak that resonated deeply with the terrified old money crowd. They looked at her with pure, unadulterated sympathy, completely blind to the venomous reality of her true nature. Beatrice slowly lifted her head, her eyes sweeping across the sea of sympathetic faces, expertly transitioning from a broken victim to a determined crusader. "That is why I called you all here tonight on such incredibly short notice," she announced, her voice gaining a sudden desperate strength that commanded the room. "We are facing an entirely new breed of predator. These con artists do not break into our homes with weapons. They break in with fake smiles, forged legal contracts, and corporate loopholes designed to strip us of everything our ancestors built. I will not allow what happened to me to happen to anyone else in this beautiful, tight-knit community." She gestured grandly to the blank banners positioned around the stage, envisioning her new empire. "I am officially launching the Beatrice Family Foundation. This initiative will provide aggressive legal defense funds for vulnerable seniors facing financial abuse and hostile corporate takeovers. We will fight these fraudsters in the courts, expose their tactics, and drive them out of our society forever. But I cannot do it alone. I need your help. I need your financial support to build a war chest so massive that no trailer park predator will ever dare target our families again." The emotional manipulation was flawless, striking directly at the core of their privilege. The elite crowd, deeply paranoid about losing their own generational wealth to outsiders, immediately took the bait. A loud murmur of indignant agreement rolled through the ballroom. Men in custom-tailored tuxedos reached into their breast pockets, pulling out expensive designer pens and leather-bound checkbooks. Wives leaned into their husbands, whispering furiously about the sheer audacity of the crime, urging them to donate generously to the noble cause. Beatrice watched the checkbooks appear across the room, a fleeting, victorious gleam flashing in her eyes, before she expertly masked it with another bout of dramatic sobbing. She was seconds away from securing millions of dollars in fraudulent donations, cementing her survival and my supposed destruction in one masterful stroke. At the very back of the grand ballroom, standing near the heavy oak doors, I remained perfectly still. I held my crystal glass of sparkling water, taking a slow, calm sip as I watched the entire theatrical performance unfold. I did not scream. I did not rush the stage to defend myself or hurl counter-accusations. I simply watched her dig her own grave deeper with every single lie she broadcasted over the expensive sound system. The wealthy investors standing nearest to me shot me looks of absolute disgust, physically backing away as if my supposed crimes were contagious, but I remained completely unbothered. I knew exactly what was about to happen. While the entire room was entirely fixated on Beatrice's Oscar-worthy tears, Jasmine had quietly slipped away from my side. Moving with the silent, lethal grace of a shadow, she had navigated the edges of the crowded room, completely avoiding the harsh overhead lights and the wandering eyes of the distracted guests. She made her way directly toward the audio-visual control booth elevated at the back of the hall. The young sound technician inside was too busy watching Beatrice's speech to notice Jasmine step smoothly into the narrow booth beside him. She flashed him her elite corporate badge, confidently requested to check a technical setting for the venue, and seamlessly plugged a sleek silver flash drive into the primary media server. Beatrice, entirely unaware of the technological trap closing around her, suddenly spotted me standing calmly at the back of the room. A surge of vindictive adrenaline fueled her final fatal mistake. She raised her hand, pointing a dramatic, trembling finger directly at me, drawing the angry, judgmental eyes of every single person in the country club. "Look at her," Beatrice screamed into the microphone, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "The face of a thief. The monster who stole my family's future." Suddenly, the massive projector screen hanging directly behind Beatrice flashed blindingly bright. Beatrice gripped the edges of the mahogany podium, her mouth opening to release the first rehearsed tragic sob of her grand monologue. But before a single deceitful syllable could escape her lips, the state-of-the-art audio system emitted a sharp, piercing screech of static. The brutal feedback forced several wealthy guests in the front row to physically wince and cover their ears, instantly shattering the carefully constructed atmosphere of elite sympathy. High above the crowd enclosed in the shadowed glass-paneled audio-visual control booth, Jasmine executed her technological strike with flawless, terrifying precision. She had bypassed the country club's standard event protocols in seconds, her fingers flying expertly across the mixing board. The massive cinematic projector screen suspended directly behind Beatrice had been programmed to display a deeply sentimental, emotionally manipulative visual campaign. It was supposed to feature a rotating carousel of Beatrice posing gracefully with local orphans, handing oversized novelty checks to animal shelters, and smiling benevolently at children's hospital galas. Instead, the heartwarming, carefully curated propaganda abruptly flickered and died. The screen plunged the stage into pitch blackness for one terrifying, confusing second. Then a blindingly brilliant high-definition image materialized on the screen, casting a harsh fluorescent white glow directly across Beatrice's hunched shoulders. It was not a photograph. It was a massive, relentlessly detailed financial spreadsheet. The document was magnified to 20 feet wide, making the text crisp, dominating, and absolutely impossible to misinterpret. Columns of dates, routing numbers, and highly confidential banking transactions dominated the entire stage, heavily annotated with glowing neon red and yellow highlights. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and visceral. A collective sharp gasp rippled across the sea of custom tuxedos and designer gowns. These were not ordinary, easily confused citizens. This ballroom was entirely populated by hedge fund managers, private equity directors, corporate sharks, and venture capitalists. They were individuals who spent their entire professional lives dissecting quarterly reports, identifying financial anomalies, and sniffing out corporate fraud. They instantly recognized exactly what they were looking at, and the realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. The sudden dramatic shift in the lighting, combined with the horrified, wide-eyed expressions of her wealthy audience, caused Beatrice to falter. She slowly turned her head, peering over her shoulder to look at the giant screen. Her jaw unhinged, dropping open in absolute, unadulterated terror. The color violently drained from her heavily powdered face, leaving her looking hollow and sickly. Displayed in unforgiving massive print for the most powerful families in Connecticut to analyze were the deeply guarded, unredacted internal ledgers of the Beatrice Family Foundation. This was the very charity she was currently using as a moral shield, the exact fund she had just begged them to pour their money into. The highlighted rows told a story of systematic, relentless embezzlement. The documents clearly displayed vast sums of charitable donations being immediately routed into offshore holding accounts. They exposed hundreds of thousands of dollars aggressively recategorized as administrative overhead and private consulting fees. These fraudulent withdrawals perfectly matched the exact dates of Beatrice's luxury European vacations, her custom diamond jewelry purchases, and her high-end cosmetic procedures. A staggering $50,000 earmarked for orphanage structural repairs had been directly wired to a luxury car dealership for the down payment on Colin's Porsche. Another $80,000 designated for pediatric medical research had been funneled straight into a private contractor's account to remodel Beatrice's summer home. Every stolen dollar was meticulously tracked and displayed in towering, irrefutable numbers. The elite crowd began to murmur, and the sound was not filled with the sympathetic pity Beatrice had enjoyed just 3 minutes earlier. It was a low, dangerous rumble of cold, calculating anger. The heavy gold-plated designer pens that had been poised to write massive checks were slowly lowered. The leather-bound checkbooks snapped shut with definitive echoing thuds. Men narrowed their eyes, crossing their arms over their chests as they realized the weeping woman on stage had been actively treating them like gullible fools for over a decade. At the very back of the grand ballroom, leaning casually against the mahogany bar, I remained perfectly still. I held a crystal flute of vintage champagne, taking a slow, calm sip, as I watched the entire theatrical performance implode. I did not scream. I did not rush the stage to defend myself or hurl counter-accusations. I simply watched her dig her own grave deeper with every single lie she broadcasted. The wealthy investors standing nearest to me shot me nervous, apprehensive glances, but I remained completely unbothered. I knew exactly what was about to happen. From the heavy shadows at the back of the ballroom, the door of the audio-visual booth swung open. Jasmine stepped out into the ambient light. She did not run, and she did not rush. She descended the carpeted steps with the measured, terrifyingly calm pacing of an elite lead prosecutor preparing to deliver a lethal closing argument to a jury. She held a sleek black wireless microphone loosely in her right hand, her posture radiating absolute dominance. She walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. The wealthy crowd, usually so arrogant and unyielding, practically parted for her, like the Red Sea instinctively making way for the aura of power she projected. Jasmine's voice boomed over the venue's surround sound system, echoing with absolute clinical legal precision. The sheer volume and authority of her voice completely drowned out Beatrice, who was frantically tapping her own microphone, desperately trying to speak over the exposure. But Jasmine had already killed the audio feed to the podium. Beatrice was left mouthing words silently, looking like a panicked, suffocating fish, gasping for air on dry land. "Since we are asking for donations tonight," Jasmine announced, her tone sharp, authoritative, and entirely unforgiving. She did not raise her voice. She simply commanded the space. "I thought the esteemed donors of Oak Ridge should see exactly where their money has been going for the past decade." Beatrice lunged forward, grabbing the edges of the podium, her eyes wide with manic desperation. She reached for the microphone cord, trying to manually reconnect it, her manicured nails scraping uselessly against the metal stand. She looked out at her friends, her society peers, her lifelong allies, begging them silently to ignore the damning evidence illuminating the stage. But not a single person met her gaze. They were entirely captivated by Jasmine, who stopped exactly 10 feet away from the front of the stage. Jasmine raised a small black presentation remote in her left hand. She looked directly into Beatrice's terrified eyes and offered a smile that contained absolutely zero warmth. "I know reading raw data can be exhausting at a gala," Jasmine said smoothly into the microphone. "So my team simplified the financials for you." Jasmine presses a button on her remote, pulling up a pie chart that makes every millionaire in the room choke on their drinks. Beatrice leaned into the heavy metal microphone, letting a perfectly calibrated, trembling breath echo across the vast, opulent ballroom. The sound instantly commanded the absolute attention of every hedge fund manager, socialite, and real estate tycoon in the room. She lowered her head, allowing the harsh glare of the spotlight to illuminate the solitary manufactured tear rolling down her powdered cheek. "My dearest friends," Beatrice began, her voice cracking with expertly crafted vulnerability, "I stand before you tonight, not as the proud matriarch you have known for decades, but as a victim, a mother who loved far too much and trusted far too blindly." She paused, letting the heavy, uncomfortable silence amplify her performance. She gripped the edges of the podium tightly, projecting the image of a fragile woman barely holding herself together. She then painted a vivid, entirely fabricated picture of the past. She claimed that 10 years ago she had opened the doors of her sacred family estate to a troubled, destitute teenage mother who had absolutely nowhere else to turn. She described how she had taken Rebecca in out of the sheer goodness of her heart, offering her a safe haven, a respectable family name, and unconditional love. "I treated her like my own flesh and blood," Beatrice wept, clutching her chest as if physically wounded by the memory. "I gave her child a home. I gave her the capital to start a small business, hoping to teach her the value of honest work and integrate her into our society. And how did she repay my endless charity with the most calculated, vicious betrayal imaginable?" The crowd gasped in unison, completely hooked by the tragic narrative. Beatrice spun a horrifying tale of elder abuse, claiming that I had spent the last decade secretly learning the family's financial vulnerabilities. She accused me of forging highly complex legal documents, manipulating her son into a state of total emotional despair, and illegally seizing her ancestral home while she was entirely helpless to stop it. She described the eviction with horrifying, entirely false details, claiming I had laughed as my hired thugs threw her out into the freezing winter rain, stripping her of her dignity and her sanctuary. She played the role of the devastated broken dowager to absolute perfection, wrapping her vicious lies in a veneer of maternal heartbreak that resonated deeply with the terrified old money crowd. They looked at her with pure, unadulterated sympathy, completely blind to the venomous reality of her true nature. Beatrice slowly lifted her head, her eyes sweeping across the sea of sympathetic faces, expertly transitioning from a broken victim to a determined crusader. "That is why I called you all here tonight on such incredibly short notice," she announced, her voice gaining a sudden desperate strength that commanded the room. "We are facing an entirely new breed of predator. These con artists do not break into our homes with weapons. They break in with fake smiles, forged legal contracts, and corporate loopholes designed to strip us of everything our ancestors built. I will not allow what happened to me to happen to anyone else in this beautiful, tight-knit community." She gestured grandly to the blank banners positioned around the stage, envisioning her new empire. "I am officially launching the Beatrice Family Foundation. This initiative will provide aggressive legal defense funds for vulnerable seniors facing financial abuse and hostile corporate takeovers. We will fight these fraudsters in the courts, expose their tactics, and drive them out of our society forever. But I cannot do it alone. I need your help. I need your financial support to build a war chest so massive that no trailer park predator will ever dare target our families again." The emotional manipulation was flawless, striking directly at the core of their privilege. The elite crowd, deeply paranoid about losing their own generational wealth to outsiders, immediately took the bait. A loud murmur of indignant agreement rolled through the ballroom. Men in custom-tailored tuxedos reached into their breast pockets, pulling out expensive designer pens and leather-bound checkbooks. Wives leaned into their husbands, whispering furiously about the sheer audacity of the crime, urging them to donate generously to the noble cause. Beatrice watched the checkbooks appear across the room, a fleeting, victorious gleam flashing in her eyes, before she expertly masked it with another bout of dramatic sobbing. She was seconds away from securing millions of dollars in fraudulent donations, cementing her survival and my supposed destruction in one masterful stroke. At the very back of the grand ballroom, standing near the heavy oak doors, I remained perfectly still. I held my crystal glass of champagne, taking a slow, calm sip as I watched the entire theatrical performance unfold. I did not scream. I did not rush the stage to defend myself or hurl counter-accusations. I simply watched her dig her own grave deeper with every single lie she broadcasted over the expensive sound system. The wealthy investors standing nearest to me shot me looks of absolute disgust, physically backing away, as if my supposed crimes were contagious, but I remained completely unbothered. I knew exactly what was about to happen. While the entire room was entirely fixated on Beatrice's Oscar-worthy tears, Jasmine had quietly slipped away from my side. Moving with the silent, lethal grace of a shadow, she had navigated the edges of the crowded room, completely avoiding the harsh overhead lights and the wandering eyes of the distracted guests. She made her way directly toward the audio-visual control booth elevated at the back of the hall. The young sound technician inside was too busy watching Beatrice's speech to notice Jasmine step smoothly into the narrow booth beside him. She flashed him her elite corporate badge, confidently requested to check a technical setting for the venue, and seamlessly plugged a sleek silver flash drive into the primary media server. Beatrice, entirely unaware of the technological trap closing around her, suddenly spotted me standing calmly at the back of the room. A surge of vindictive adrenaline fueled her final fatal mistake. She raised her hand, pointing a dramatic, trembling finger directly at me, drawing the angry, judgmental eyes of every single person in the country club. "Look at her!" Beatrice screamed into the microphone, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "The face of a thief!" Suddenly, the massive projector screen behind Beatrice flashed blindingly bright. The pie chart blazing across the massive projector screen was an absolute masterpiece of financial ruin. Jasmine stood center stage, her posture completely relaxed as she dissected the graphic with the clinical, merciless precision of a forensic accountant. The largest slice of the pie, rendered in a sickening, glaring red, represented a staggering 80% of all charitable donations given to the Beatrice Family Foundation. Jasmine tapped her remote again, and the screen fractured into a rapid-fire collage of scanned irrefutable receipts and bank routing numbers. $50,000 wired directly to a luxury boutique in Paris for a collection of rare exotic skin Hermes handbags. $100,000 siphoned into an offshore shell company to cover month-long VIP European river cruises and chartered yachts in Monaco. Another $200,000, originally earmarked for a local children's hospital, transferred in the dead of night to an underground syndicate to cover Colin's catastrophic escalating high-stakes poker debts. Every stolen dollar was meticulously tracked, highlighted, and displayed in towering, undeniable numbers. In the deeply insulated, hyper-paranoid world of the American elite, tax evasion and charity fraud are the ultimate cardinal sins. These were people who hired armies of lawyers and accountants to protect their wealth from the government at all costs. To realize they had been actively scammed, that their own generous tax-deductible donations had been illegally funneled into Beatrice's private designer closets, sent a shockwave of absolute revulsion through the ballroom. The polite, sympathetic silence completely evaporated. The room erupted in a chaotic, deafening roar of outrage. Millionaires violently shoved their checkbooks back into their custom tuxedo pockets. Socialites gasped, their hands flying to their mouths as they realized the terrifying immediate implications. By donating to a fraudulent charity, they were now directly associated with a massive financial crime. They were looking at impending, brutal, highly publicized audits from the Internal Revenue Service. Beatrice realized she was losing everything. Her legacy, her freedom, and her carefully curated social standing were all burning to ash in front of her eyes. Pure panic clawed at her throat. She desperately lunged for the microphone stand, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the metal pole. "It is a lie," Beatrice screamed into the microphone, her voice entirely stripped of its former manufactured elegance, now echoing with raw, unhinged hysteria. "This black woman is trying to frame me. Derek, do something. Your wife is ruining your family." The blinding overhead spotlight shifted abruptly, slicing through the dimly lit room and landing directly on Derek. Beatrice stared at her son, her eyes wide with manic expectation. She fully expected him to be the dutiful, obedient heir. She expected him to march up to the stage, silence his wife, command respect from the outraged crowd, and put me, the supposedly trashy daughter-in-law, back in my proper place. She expected him to save her. Derek stepped out of the shadows. He did not look conflicted. He did not look torn. He slowly walked up the carpeted steps onto the main stage, his footsteps heavy and deliberate against the polished wood. He stopped, standing face to face with his mother, under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the spotlight. He turned his head slowly, looking out at the furious, disgusted crowd of investors, and then he turned his gaze back to Beatrice. The look on his face was not protective. It was a mask of absolute, chilling disgust. He reached out and took the wireless microphone directly from Jasmine's hand. The ballroom, previously echoing with the angry shouts of betrayed donors, fell into a sudden, breathless silence. Everyone waited to see how the golden son would handle the complete destruction of his family's empire. Beatrice reached out her trembling fingers, attempting to grasp his forearm, seeking the maternal comfort and blind loyalty she had exploited for his entire life. Derek physically recoiled, stepping back, as if her touch would burn him. "Jasmine is not framing you, Mom," Derek said into the microphone. His voice did not echo with anger, but with a cold, devastating finality that cut through the room like a scalpel. "She is simply reading the files I gave her." Beatrice froze. Her outstretched hand hovered in the empty air. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. Her mouth moved, trying to form a frantic denial, but no sound came out. "I found your hidden ledgers last month." Derek continued, his voice echoing relentlessly off the crystal chandeliers. "I found the offshore account routing numbers. I found the fake invoices you used to drain my own inheritance, and I found the forged eviction notices you drew up to throw Rebecca out onto the street. You spent my entire life telling me that I had to protect this family from outsiders. You warned me that people like Rebecca were predators trying to steal our legacy. But you were the predator, Mom. You stole from your friends. You stole from your own son. You destroyed an innocent woman's life just to feed your own endless pathetic vanity. Beatrice shook her head frantically, tears of genuine panic finally spilling over her heavily powdered cheeks. Derek, please. She begged, her voice a pathetic, high-pitched whimper, completely devoid of a microphone. You do not understand. I did it for us. I did it to protect our status. You cannot do this to your own mother. I am not doing anything to you, Derek replied, his gaze unwavering, devoid of any remaining sympathy. You did this to yourself. You thought you were untouchable because of a last name and a country club membership. But those documents on that screen are just a fraction of the evidence. I was the one who unlocked your private safe. I was the one who handed every single unredacted ledger, every fake charity receipt, and every fraudulent wire transfer directly over to the IRS. The finality of his words struck Beatrice like a physical blow to the chest. Her knees buckled beneath her expensive designer gown. She collapsed, entirely crumpling onto the hard wooden stage in a heap of emerald silk and shattered pride. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with ugly, gasping sobs. It was the ultimate, inescapable societal execution. There was no spin, no elegant excuse, no elite public relations firm that could ever repair the catastrophic damage of her own son publicly confirming her identity as a relentless, calculating criminal. The crowd of Connecticut's most powerful elite did not offer a single ounce of pity. The sheer toxicity of Beatrice's actions made her an instant radioactive liability. They turned their backs on her in perfect, disgusted unison. The mass exodus was swift and brutal. Hedge fund managers practically sprinted for the heavy mahogany exit doors, aggressively pulling their cell phones from their pockets to frantically dial their personal defense attorneys and corporate crisis management teams. Wealthy socialites pushed past each other, desperate to flee the building, and physically distanced themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Beatrice Family Foundation. The grand, opulent ballroom, which just moments ago had been a glowing fortress of elite privilege and guaranteed salvation, emptied out in a matter of seconds, leaving behind nothing but shattered champagne glasses and overturned chairs. I stood at the back of the room watching the panicked billionaires flee into the cold night air. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of vindication wash over me. The woman who had treated me like disposable trash, who had mocked my background and tried to completely erase my existence, was now broken and sobbing on the floor of her precious country club, abandoned by everyone she had ever tried to impress. Derek handed the microphone back to Jasmine, giving me a brief, silent nod across the empty ballroom before stepping down from the stage and walking away from his mother forever. Beatrice remained on her knees, crying out into the empty, echoing hall, begging for someone, anyone, to come back and help her. But the polite society she had worshipped her entire life was entirely gone. The only response she received came from the outside, through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the Oak Ridge Country Club. The dark night was suddenly illuminated. Brilliant strobing flashes of aggressive red and blue lights began to bounce and reflect harshly against the elegant interior walls, painting Beatrice's terrified face in alternating colors. The blinding lights multiplied as a convoy of heavily armored federal agency vehicles silently surrounded the perimeter of the building. The IRS and the FBI had not waited for Monday morning. They were here for Beatrice. The raid on the Oak Ridge Country Club was a spectacle of absolute destruction. Federal agents swarmed the grand ballroom, securing documents, confiscating computer servers, and physically detaining Beatrice before she could even wipe the ruined mascara from her face. The fallout from that night was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. By Monday morning, the once impenetrable Beatrice Family Foundation was nothing more than a crime scene wrapped in yellow federal tape. The Internal Revenue Service acted with terrifying surgical efficiency. They deployed agents to systematically freeze every single bank account, investment portfolio, shell company, and offshore trust tied to both Beatrice and Colin. The generational wealth they had so arrogantly flaunted evaporated overnight, leaving them with absolutely zero access to capital. Fast forward 3 weeks later. The cold, sterile walls of the county courthouse provided the perfect, unforgiving backdrop for the final execution of my marriage. I sat perfectly straight at the plaintiff's table, wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit, projecting nothing but absolute composure and quiet power. Jasmine sat directly beside me, organizing a thick stack of heavy manila folders with the clinical detachment of a surgeon preparing to amputate a diseased limb. Across the aisle, Colin looked like a completely different man. The smug, entitled heir who had once confidently ordered me out of my own home was entirely gone. He was sweating profusely in a cheap, wrinkled suit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame, his eyes darting around the courtroom with raw, unfiltered panic. The divorce hearing was a masterclass in legal annihilation. The judge, an older, no-nonsense woman with absolutely zero patience for old money entitlement, wasted no time. Because his assets were entirely frozen under a massive federal fraud investigation, Colin had been completely unable to secure high-powered legal representation. He was stuck with a thoroughly overworked, completely outgunned public defender who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. The judge aggressively struck down every single desperate motion Colin's lawyer attempted to file. Jasmine systematically dismantled his claims to any of my personal business assets. She presented irrefutable ironclad evidence that I had built my liquidation firm entirely independently, using my own capital long after he had actively abandoned our marriage and financially abused me. Realizing he was rapidly losing his grip on any potential financial lifeline, Colin completely abandoned his pride. He stood up, leaning heavily against the wooden table, and began to openly beg the judge for spousal support. He played the victim with nauseating sincerity. He claimed that my sudden massive wealth was a direct result of his emotional support during the early years of our marriage. He argued that throwing him out with absolutely nothing would leave him destitute completely, ignoring the blatant fact that he and his mother had attempted to do exactly that to me. He wept real, pathetic tears, pleading for temporary alimony just to keep a basic roof over his head. Jasmine let him finish his humiliating weeping display before she calmly stood up. She did not raise her voice. She simply handed a heavy black leather binder to the court bailiff to pass up to the judge's bench. Inside that binder was the final lethal blow. Jasmine firmly explained to the court that Colin was not entitled to a single cent of spousal support as he had actively committed gross marital waste and felony fraud. She directed the judge to the highlighted pages breaking down exactly how Colin had stolen my corporate credit cards over a period of 8 consecutive months. Jasmine walked over to the evidence monitor, bringing up the digital receipts for the entire courtroom to see. She read them off with lethal, echoing precision. She showed the court exactly where Colin had charged $50,000 for custom Hermes bags for his mistress. She displayed the confirmation emails for a $100,000 luxury European river cruise they had taken while I was working 80-hour weeks. And then came the final sickening detail. She presented the wire transfers showing he had stolen $200,000 to cover his own catastrophic escalating gambling debts, funneling the money to an underground syndicate to save his own skin. The judge slammed the heavy leather binder shut, her face rigid with absolute disgust. She looked down at Colin, who was now trembling uncontrollably and staring at his shoes. She delivered her ruling with zero hesitation and maximum severity. She denied his request for alimony entirely. She granted the divorce with prejudice, legally severing our ties immediately. Furthermore, she held him fully and solely liable for the $350,000 in fraudulent credit card debt. She looked him dead in the eye and warned him that if he failed to repay the stolen funds to my corporation, she would personally refer the matter to the district attorney for criminal fraud prosecution. The heavy wooden gavel fell with a resounding, echoing crack, severing my ties to the toxic family forever. An hour later, Colin walked out of the heavy glass courthouse doors, carrying nothing but a scuffed cheap vinyl suitcase containing a few changes of clothes. He had no luxury car waiting for him, no trust fund to fall back on, and no sprawling family estate to retreat to. I watched from the tinted window of my idling town car as he trudged down the cracked concrete sidewalk in the pouring rain. He was forced to walk 2 miles to check into a cheap, roach-infested motel on the noisy edge of the city highway. It was the exact kind of destitute, miserable existence his mother had always mocked and feared. But as my driver pulled away from the curb, leaving Colin shivering in the rain, my sense of total victory was heavily tempered by a cold, lingering shadow of caution. Colin was permanently neutralized, financially broken, and entirely removed from the board. But I knew Beatrice better than anyone else in the world. A narcissist of her extreme, terrifying magnitude never truly surrendered. Stripped of her stolen money, her pristine reputation, and her impending freedom, she was more dangerous than she had ever been. She was a cornered, desperate animal facing a federal prison sentence. As I looked out at the passing city skyline, I knew with absolute chilling certainty that she was not entirely finished yet. A woman who had spent her entire life manipulating reality would always have one last desperate, devastating move left to play. For the next 6 months, however, that move did not come. Instead, the dust finally began to settle, bringing a profound and hard-earned peace to my life. The chaotic, adrenaline-fueled warfare of courtrooms and federal raids faded into a quiet, relentless rhythm of corporate expansion. I threw myself entirely into scaling my distressed asset liquidation firm. The market was incredibly lucrative, and my reputation as a ruthless, highly efficient operator brought in a flood of premium clients. My company specialized in acquiring heavily leveraged, poorly managed luxury portfolios, stripping out the toxic debt and turning massive profits. It was incredibly satisfying work, but nothing compared to the absolute triumph of my latest acquisitions. Following the massive federal indictments against the Beatrice Family Foundation, the government began seizing their assets to pay back the defrauded charities and cover monumental IRS penalties. Their ancestral estates, their sprawling equestrian centers, and their elite corporate holdings were all thrown into public auction. I was waiting with a massive war chest and zero hesitation. I systematically bought up the very empire that had once been used to oppress me. I acquired the sprawling Connecticut summer estate, where Beatrice had once forced me to sleep in the unheated servant quarters. I sent contractors to tear down her gaudy, gold-plated family crests and replace them with the sleek, modern logo of my own firm. I purchased Colin's luxury downtown penthouse for a fraction of its original value, gutting his velvet-lined poker room and transforming it into a high-yield corporate rental property. Every piece of wealth they had stolen and flaunted was legally, rightfully absorbed into my growing empire. I was not just erasing their legacy, I was paving over it with my own. The country club elite who had once shunned me now aggressively sought my business advice, practically begging me to manage their portfolios. I kept them at a cold professional distance, enjoying the absolute shift in the power dynamic. The greatest victory, however, was not financial. It was the complete transformation of my son. At 15 years old, Leo had entirely shed the heavy, suffocating mantle of the family scapegoat. For years, Beatrice and Colin had actively worked to make him feel small, awkward, and unworthy, constantly comparing him to their idealized, impossible standards. Freed from their toxic psychological warfare, Leo began to thrive in ways that brought tears of pride to my eyes. He shot up several inches, but the real change was in his posture. He no longer hunched his shoulders to avoid attention. He walked with his head held high, radiating a quiet, grounded confidence that drew people to him. On a bright Tuesday morning, the heavy glass doors of my corporate headquarters slid open, and Leo walked into the main lobby. He was not wearing the baggy, wrinkled school clothes he used to hide behind. He was dressed in a sharp, custom-tailored navy suit that fit his athletic frame perfectly. Today marked the official start of his summer internship at my firm. I had refused to simply hand him an executive title. He was going to learn the business from the ground up, starting in the data analysis department. But as he confidently shook hands with my senior directors and effortlessly navigated the fast-paced corporate environment, it was undeniably clear that he possessed a brilliant analytical mind. He had inherited my sharp eye for identifying market trends and an innate understanding of complex financial structures. I stood near the edge of the mezzanine, leaning against the glass railing as I watched him interact with the staff. He was smiling, offering insightful comments, and absorbing information like a sponge. The employees adored him, not because he was the boss's son, but because he was genuinely respectful, fiercely intelligent, and completely devoid of the toxic entitlement that had poisoned his father's bloodline. I felt a profound, overwhelming wave of maternal pride. I had protected him. I had built a fortress around him, and within those walls, he had grown into a remarkable young man. He was safe, he was loved, and he was stepping into a future that belonged entirely to him. I turned away from the mezzanine and walked back into my expansive corner office where Jasmine was waiting. The heavy mahogany desk was covered in final partnership agreements. Jasmine sat in one of the plush leather chairs, her posture radiating absolute authority. Today was not just an ordinary Tuesday. Today was the day we officially cemented our alliance. I slid a sleek gold pen across the desk. Jasmine picked it up, her eyes meeting mine with a shared understanding of everything we had conquered, and signed the final contract. She was officially the new chief legal officer of my firm. We had fought shoulder to shoulder in the trenches, dismantling a corrupt dynasty piece by piece. Now we were building an impenetrable female-led corporate powerhouse. I walked over to the private bar, opening a bottle of vintage champagne and pouring 2 crystal flutes. I handed one to Jasmine, raising my glass in a silent toast to our absolute victory. We clinked our glasses together, the delicate chime echoing through the quiet, sunlit office. We had won. The empire was ours. Just as the expensive champagne touched my lips, the sharp, urgent buzz of the executive intercom shattered the peaceful atmosphere. I set my glass down, pressing the speaker button. The voice of my head receptionist filtered through the speaker, tight with alarm. "Ma'am, there is a woman screaming in the lobby. She is refusing to leave." I set my crystal flute down on the polished mahogany desk. The delicate chiming sound of the glass against the wood felt entirely too loud in the sudden, tense silence of the corner office. Jasmine did not even blink. She simply set her own glass aside and picked up her tablet, instantly transitioning from our moment of celebration back to a state of absolute corporate warfare. I pressed the silver intercom button on my desk, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of panic. I instructed the receptionist to hold her ground, not to engage the woman, and that I was coming down. Walking out of the executive suite, I approached the transparent glass elevator that overlooked the entire ground floor of our corporate headquarters. As the cab smoothly descended, the pristine, expansive marble lobby came into full view. There she was, Beatrice. The woman screaming frantically at my front desk was completely unrecognizable from the terrifying, perfectly manicured matriarch who had relentlessly controlled my life for a decade. The custom Chanel suits, the heavy diamond brooches, and the flawless, rigid blowouts were entirely gone. Beatrice was wearing a wrinkled, severely outdated beige trench coat that looked like it had been pulled from the damp back of a forgotten closet. Her hair, usually sprayed into a stiff, immovable helmet of generational wealth, hung in stringy, unkempt strands around her pale, gaunt face. She was frantically slapping her bare hands against the polished reception counter, demanding to be led upstairs immediately. Her voice, entirely stripped of its aristocratic Connecticut drawl, sounded harsh, ragged, and desperate. She was screaming about federal agents seizing her vehicles, about her offshore bank accounts being completely frozen, and about a landlord who had just locked her out of a temporary low-rent apartment on the grimy edge of the city. The IRS had systematically dismantled her entire life, and the impending federal indictment hung over her head like a lethal guillotine. She had absolutely nowhere left to run. Her high society friends had vanished like smoke, completely blocking her numbers the very moment the federal agents raided the country club. Her golden son Colin was currently living in a roach-infested motel by the highway, entirely useless to her. I was her absolute last resort. I watched her from the descending elevator, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical observation. The monster who had terrorized my youth, who had tried to discard me like garbage, was now just a desperate, pathetic woman throwing a loud tantrum in my lobby. The elevator doors glided open with a soft, melodic chime. Beatrice instantly snapped her head toward the sound. The moment her sunken, frantic eyes locked onto mine, her entire demeanor shifted with terrifying, calculated speed. She realized immediately that aggressive demands would get her absolutely nowhere in a building I owned and controlled. So she instantly pivoted to the only weapon she had left in her arsenal: weaponized maternal guilt. Beatrice threw herself away from the reception desk and practically lunged toward the center of the lobby. With a loud, highly theatrical wail, she let her knees buckle beneath her. She collapsed onto the cold marble floor, her outdated coat pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with loud, exaggerated sobs, specifically designed to echo across the cavernous, quiet room. "Rebecca!" she wailed, her voice cracking with expertly manufactured heartbreak. "Please, I am begging you. I have lost everything. They took my home. They took my dignity. I am a sick old woman with nothing left." She peeked through her fingers, quickly assessing her audience. Several of my employees had stopped in their tracks, holding their briefcases and morning coffees, staring in shock at the spectacle unfolding by the security gates. Beatrice directed her performance straight at them, raising her voice to ensure every single bystander heard her tragic, victimized narrative. "I do not care about the money anymore," Beatrice cried out, reaching a trembling, dramatic hand toward me. "Keep the houses. Keep all the assets. I just want my family back. I just want to see my precious grandson. I want to see Leo. He is my flesh and blood. You cannot keep a loving grandmother away from her only grandson. Please, Rebecca, do not let me die without holding him one last time." It was a masterclass in toxic emotional manipulation. She was heavily banking on the basic human decency of my staff, hoping their natural sympathy for a weeping elderly woman would force me into a corner. She fully expected me to feel embarrassed by the public scene, to rush forward to quiet her down, to pull her off the floor and hide her in a private office, where she could begin sinking her claws back into my conscience. She thought the mention of Leo would break me. She had no idea that Leo was currently 2 floors above us, wearing a tailored suit, thriving in his internship, completely immune to her poison. The head of my security team stepped forward, his hand resting firmly on his radio, looking directly at me for the signal to forcibly remove her from the premises. I raised a single hand, signaling him to stand down. I did not want her dragged out. I wanted her to face exactly what she had created. I stepped forward. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels against the marble floor echoed loudly, cutting right through the sound of her fake, gasping sobs. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured, undeniable pace of a woman who owned the very ground she stood on. The employees watching the scene parted seamlessly, giving me a clear, unobstructed path to the center of the room. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from her crumpled, shaking form. I did not reach out to help her up. I did not offer a single shred of comfort or sympathy. I simply stood tall and looked down at the woman who had spent 10 years treating me like a disposable servant, who had mocked my background, who had tried to leave me completely destitute while attempting to steal my son. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, waiting for the familiar, submissive daughter-in-law to bend to her will. But that vulnerable girl was dead and gone. I reached inside the tailored breast pocket of my suit jacket. My fingers closed around a thick, heavy manila envelope that Jasmine had finalized just an hour ago. I pulled it out, letting the harsh, bright lobby lights catch the official legal seals stamped heavily across the front. Without a single ounce of hesitation, I tossed the envelope forward. It hit the marble floor with a heavy, definitive smack, sliding to a stop directly against Beatrice's knees. "You were never a grandmother." The heavy thud of the envelope hitting the marble floor acted like a physical blow. Beatrice froze. Her loud, gasping sobs ceased instantly, cut off as if a switch had been violently flipped. The grotesque mask of the grieving, desperate grandmother vanished in a single heartbeat, leaving behind only the stark, pale reality of a cornered predator. She stared at the thick manila package resting against her knees. The harsh fluorescent lights of the lobby reflected off the official legal seals binding the flap. The utter silence in the room was deafening. My employees, the security guards, the executives passing through the mezzanine above, everyone stood completely motionless, watching the absolute destruction of a dynasty unfold in real time. Slowly, Beatrice lowered her hands from her face. Her cheeks were completely dry. There was not a single trace of genuine sorrow in her eyes, only a rapidly escalating sense of dread. She looked up at me, her gaze darting frantically searching for any sign of hesitation, weakness, or mercy in my posture. She found none. I stood as rigid as a statue, projecting nothing but absolute freezing authority. Compelled by an obsessive need to maintain some illusion of control, her hands began to move. They trembled violently. Her perfectly manicured nails, now chipped and ruined from weeks of federal investigations, and sheer panic scratched against the polished floor as she reached forward. She grasped the envelope. It was heavy, weighted down by a decade and a half of meticulously gathered evidence. Her breathing grew shallow and erratic. She tried to tear the flap open, but her hands were shaking so severely that she fumbled, her fingers slipping uselessly against the thick paper. She tore at the official seals, her movements growing increasingly frantic, ripping the paper with a harsh grating sound that echoed loudly across the cavernous lobby. She finally managed to pry the flap open, exposing the thick stack of documents inside. Beatrice reached inside and pulled out the contents. They were not modern financial ledgers, nor were they recent IRS indictments. The papers on top were old. Their edges were slightly yellowed with age, preserving a history she thought she had buried and destroyed forever. Beatrice stared at the first page, and the last remaining drops of blood completely drained from her gaunt face. It was a 15-year-old invoice from an elite, highly discreet private investigation firm based in Boston. Stamped diagonally across the center in bold red ink were the words, "Paid in full," positioned directly next to a routing number that belonged exclusively to Beatrice's private offshore trust. She flipped to the next page, her breath hitching audibly. More invoices. Thousands of dollars paid to operatives for surveillance background checks and targeted harassment. Beneath the invoices lay a stack of carefully preserved copies of anonymous typed letters. They were printed on heavy cream-colored watermarked cardstock, the exact customized luxury stationery Beatrice had favored a decade and a half ago. Her hands shook so violently that the papers began to slip from her grasp, scattering across the pristine marble. She frantically scrambled to gather them, her eyes darting across the typed words. These were the exact letters that had been sent to my university dean, to the Academic Scholarship Committee, and to the Campus Housing Authority 15 years ago. They contained vicious, entirely fabricated allegations about my character, my background, and my supposed involvement in illegal activities. She read the words she had written herself, the lies that had systematically dismantled my entire life. She saw the letter claiming I was running an illicit gambling ring out of my dorm room, the letter falsely accusing me of academic fraud, and the meticulously forged documents designed to make me look like a dangerous liability to the university. She recognized her own ruthless handiwork immediately. The devastating reality of what she was holding crashed down upon her, crushing her chest. She had orchestrated my entire downfall. She had hired professionals to systematically destroy my independent life, stripping away my education and my resources to render me completely destitute. She had engineered my absolute desperation just so Colin could swoop in like a wealthy savior, trapping me in a marriage where I would be forever dependent, forever grateful, and forever under her absolute tyrannical control. She had bought me like property. I took one single step closer, looming over her kneeling figure. The sharp crack of my heel against the marble snapped her attention back to me. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. In that perfectly silent lobby, every single word I spoke carried the lethal, unstoppable force of an avalanche. "Did you really think I didn't know?" I asked, my voice slicing through the air cold as ice. Beatrice jerked her head up. Her mouth opened and closed in mute, suffocating panic, unable to form a single coherent syllable. The papers shook in her trembling hands, the crisp, rattling sound amplifying her terror. "Did you think I was just a dumb 19-year-old girl who believed her full-ride college scholarship was revoked by a random administrative accident? I continued, letting the cold fury of 15 years pour into my tone. Did you honestly believe I bought the story that the anonymous tips destroying my reputation, my housing, and my entire future just happened to coincide perfectly with the exact moment your son took a sudden interest in me? She tried to scramble backward, her shoes slipping uselessly against the polished floor, but there was nowhere to run. The glass security gates were locked behind her. My security team flanked the exits. The employees formed a silent, impenetrable wall around us. You thought you were a master puppeteer, I said, my voice dropping to a steady, lethal whisper that demanded absolute attention. You thought you had completely broken my spirit before I even stepped foot in your massive, suffocating house. You stripped away my degree, you took away my dorm, and you made sure I was facing total financial ruin. You made sure I had no friends left, no professors willing to vouch for me, and absolutely no way to survive on my own. You did all of that so Colin could play the hero, so he could offer me a ring and a roof, and I would be too terrified and too broken to say no. Beatrice's lips trembled. Rebecca, I swear I just wanted what was best. Do not speak. I commanded, the absolute authority in my voice, forcing her mouth shut instantly. You do not get to speak. You only get to listen. I stepped even closer, forcing her to crane her neck to look up at me. For 10 years I sat at your dining table. I smiled while you insulted my clothes, my manners, and my family background. I stayed perfectly silent while you paraded your wealth in front of me, constantly reminding me that I was nothing but a charity case your son had taken pity on. I let you believe you had won. I let you believe I was exactly the submissive, terrified little girl you had meticulously engineered me to be. I pointed down at the scattered papers on the marble floor. But you made one fatal miscalculation, Beatrice. You left a paper trail. You were so arrogant, so entirely convinced of your own untouchable superiority, that you paid your private investigators directly from your own offshore accounts. You used your own custom stationery to ruin my life, because you loved the thrill of holding my destruction in your own hands. You thought your money made you completely invisible. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her shoulders slumped, and the last vestiges of her aristocratic pride evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell. I found those receipts a decade ago. I revealed the truth hanging in the air like a death sentence. I found them while Colin was too busy gambling away his trust fund to notice me going through the home office. I found the absolute proof of exactly what you did to me. And do you know what I did, Beatrice? She shook her head weakly, her eyes wide and bloodshot, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her own exposure. I did absolutely nothing, I said, a cold, triumphant smile touching the corners of my mouth. I smiled at you the very next morning over breakfast. I poured your coffee. I thanked you for your supposed generosity. And then I went to work. I spent every single day of the next 10 years building my company in secret. I used the rage you gave me as fuel. Every time you insulted me, I closed another deal. Every time Colin stole from me, I secured another corporate asset. I built an entire empire right under your nose, completely funded by the sheer, unadulterated hatred I felt for you. I crouched down slightly, bringing my face closer to hers, ensuring she could see the absolute, unwavering victory in my eyes. I didn't just want a divorce, Beatrice. A divorce would have been far too easy. I wanted this. I wanted to wait until the exact moment you thought you were completely invincible, and then I wanted to tear your entire world apart piece by piece. I bought the PI firm that you used to ruin my life. I acquired their parent company, and I own all of their historical records. I gave those exact records to the federal investigators looking into your charities. I handed the IRS the exact routing numbers for those offshore accounts you used to pay them. I did not just survive your trap. I dismantled it, and then I used the pieces to build your cage. The crowd around us remained absolutely silent, captivated by the sheer magnitude of the revelation. They were watching the complete annihilation of a woman who had built her entire life on cruelty, deception, and the systemic abuse of anyone she deemed beneath her. Beatrice clutched the yellowed invoices to her chest, her breathing ragged and shallow. The reality of her situation was finally completely inescapable. She was not just facing federal prison for tax fraud and massive embezzlement. She was facing the absolute humiliating exposure of her darkest crimes. There was no spinning this narrative. There was no manipulating her way out with fake tears or weaponized guilt. The evidence was irrefutable, it was documented, and I held all the cards. "You came here today to beg to see Leo," I said, standing back up to my full height, looking down at her with absolute disgust. "You tried to use my son as a pawn to manipulate my staff to make yourself look like a helpless victim. But you and I both know the absolute truth. You do not love Leo. You have never loved anyone but yourself. You just wanted a prop to maintain your shattered image, a final string to pull to make yourself feel relevant." I signaled to the head of my security team. He immediately stepped forward, two massive guards flanking him, ready to execute my final order with brutal efficiency. "You are going to leave this building right now," I told her, my tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. "You are going to walk out those glass doors, and you are going to go back to whatever roach-infested temporary rental the government hasn't seized yet. If you ever come within 50 feet of my building, my son, or my property ever again, I will not just call the police. I will release every single document in that envelope directly to the press. I will make sure that whatever tiny, pathetic shred of your reputation still exists is completely obliterated. The entire world will know exactly what kind of monster you truly are." Beatrice's hands shook uncontrollably as she tried to gather the scattered papers, her outdated, dirty coat dragging across the immaculate floor. She was struggling to breathe, her chest heaving, as the sheer terror of her reality completely consumed her. She looked up at me one last time, her face a mask of absolute paralyzing dread. Beatrice's eyes widen in sheer terror as she realizes Rebecca has known her darkest, most unforgivable sin for 15 years. The immaculate marble lobby of my corporate headquarters grew so profoundly quiet that the soft hum of the ventilation system sounded like a roaring engine. Beatrice remained frozen on her knees, the yellowed, damning papers clutched in her trembling, manicured hands. The air between us was thick with the suffocating weight of undeniable truth. The carefully constructed, elegant mask she had worn for decades was entirely gone, completely shattered by the absolute certainty that she had been utterly exposed. "You thought you were a master strategist," I said, my voice echoing off the high glass walls, cold and sharp enough to cut bone. "You truly believed you were the untouchable architect of my misery. I was just a 19-year-old girl. I was pregnant, terrified, and entirely alone in the world. I had fought tooth and nail for that academic scholarship. It was my only ticket out of poverty, my only chance to build a life for myself and my unborn child. And you could not stomach the thought of a working-class nobody carrying a child with your precious family bloodline." Beatrice opened her mouth, her jaw trembling violently, but her throat was completely seized with panic. No words came out. "I remember the exact day the university called me into the dean's office." I continued, stepping closer, forcing her to look up at me. "I remember the absolute confusion and the sheer blinding panic when they handed me copies of anonymous letters. Letters accusing me of academic fraud. Letters claiming I was involved in illicit activities on campus. Letters demanding an immediate review of my moral standing. My scholarship was revoked in a matter of days. I was handed an eviction notice from campus housing in the dead of winter. I lost everything overnight. I thought my entire world had collapsed due to some horrific cosmic string of bad luck." I paused, letting the memory of that desperation fill the space between us. I wanted her to feel the weight of it. "And then right on cue, there you were," I said, my tone dripping with lethal disgust. "You pulled up in your chauffeured town car wearing your pristine cashmere coat, offering a warm smile and a supposed lifeline. You played the role of the reluctant but generous matriarch perfectly. You offered me a place to stay, you offered to cover my medical bills, but it all came with a heavy, suffocating condition, did it not? You slid those adoption papers across the mahogany dining table with a sympathetic sigh. You told me I was too young, too poor, and too uneducated to raise Leo properly. You tried to coerce me into giving my own flesh and blood away to a wealthy anonymous couple just to protect your family's pristine social reputation." Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut, a sharp, ragged gasp tearing through her chest. The employees surrounding us stood in stunned absolute silence. They were witnessing the total deconstruction of a monster. When I refused to sign away my son, you pivoted your strategy. I stated the rhythm of my words, hitting her like physical strikes. You trapped me in a marriage with Colin instead. You used my absolute financial destitution to lock me in a gilded cage. For a decade, you treated me like a parasitic squatter. You reminded me every single day that I owed my survival to your charity. You mocked my clothes, you insulted my background, and you actively tried to turn my own son against me. You broke my spirit down to dust, all while knowing you were the exact reason I had nothing left. I crouched down smoothly, my tailored suit pulling tight, bringing my face perfectly level with hers. Her breath smelled stale, completely tainted by fear and exhaustion. But 5 years ago? I whispered, the venom in my voice entirely unrestrained. I was cleaning out the basement storage room of your summer estate. I was boxing up old tax records that Colin had carelessly discarded, and tucked inside a moldy, forgotten leather binder I found the financial ledgers. I found the bank transfer receipts from your offshore trust. I found the direct payments to the private investigation firm. I found the drafts of the anonymous letters you sent to my university, typed out on your customized monogrammed stationery. Beatrice's chest heaved. Her hands released the papers, letting them scatter across the floor as she wrapped her arms around her own torso, physically attempting to hold herself together. Do you want to know what I did when I found out? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not run upstairs and confront you. I sat on that cold concrete floor staring at those papers, and I felt a fundamental shift in my very soul. The fear, the submissiveness, the desperate need for your approval, it all evaporated. In its place, I felt a pure, unadulterated, blinding rage, and instead of letting that rage destroy me, I weaponized it. I stood back up, towering over her, gesturing to the massive, sprawling corporate headquarters around us. The glass elevators moving silently above the sleek marble columns, the dozens of highly paid professionals standing witness to her execution. I used that rage as fuel. I declared, my voice rising with absolute, unapologetic triumph. Every single time you insulted me at a family dinner, I went home and studied financial law until my eyes bled. Every time Colin stole from my bank account, I worked an 80-hour week to build my capital. Every time you tried to make me feel small, I acquired another distressed asset, flipped it, and multiplied my wealth. I did not just want to be successful, Beatrice. I wanted to be your absolute ruin. Beatrice shook her head frantically, her graying hair sticking to her tear-stained face. She was completely broken, her mind unable to process the sheer magnitude of the long game I had played. I spent 5 years strategically tracing every single one of your family's toxic debts, I explained, delivering the final devastating blow. I bought out the loans on your equestrian center. I acquired the holding company that owned the mortgage on your Connecticut estate. I actively partnered with the forensic accountants investigating your fraudulent charities. I built this entire empire for one specific solitary purpose. I built it to become the bank that owned you. I became the monster you designed, and I used every ounce of my power to tear your legacy to the ground. The sheer poetic irony of her situation finally crashed down upon her. She stared up at me, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream of agony. If she had just left a pregnant 19-year-old girl alone, if she had simply allowed me to finish my degree and live my life in peace, she would still be sitting in her mansion. She would still have her wealth, her country club memberships, and her unblemished reputation. She had meticulously engineered my destruction, and in doing so, she had forged the very executioner who would eventually sever her head. You did this to yourself, I stated coldly. Every single piece of your current misery is the direct result of your own malicious arrogance. You have no money, you have no home, you have no family, and you certainly have no grandson. I did not look at her anymore. She was entirely insignificant now, a hollow, discarded shell of a tyrant. I raised my hand and signaled to the head of my security team. Get this woman out of my building! I ordered, my tone shifting instantly to absolute professional detachment. If she resists, call the police and have her arrested for trespassing. 2 massive security guards immediately stepped forward. They did not handle her with the gentle respect usually afforded to high society matrons. They gripped her under her arms, hauling her roughly off the marble floor. Beatrice's legs completely gave out. She could not stand. She hung suspended between the two guards, her outdated trench coat bunching up around her shoulders. She finally found her voice, but it was nothing more than a pathetic, ragged shriek. She sobbed loudly, thrashing weakly against the guards' iron grips. She screamed my name. She screamed for her grandson. She screamed about the unfairness of the universe. The guards ignored her completely, dragging her backward across the polished floor. Her heels scraped against the marble, leaving faint scuff marks that the janitorial staff would easily buff out by the end of the day. The heavy glass doors of the main entrance slid open automatically, letting in a sharp, bitter gust of cold city wind. The guards practically carried her through the threshold, depositing her forcefully onto the cold, hard concrete of the busy sidewalk outside. They stepped back inside and the glass doors slid shut with a definitive sealing thud, cutting off the sound of her frantic, desperate wailing. Through the thick, soundproof glass, I watched her collapse onto the pavement. Pedestrians walked briskly past her, pulling their coats tight against the cold, completely ignoring the weeping, disheveled woman on the ground. She was entirely invisible to the world. She was nothing. I felt a profound, absolute silence settle over my heart. The raging fire that had burned inside my chest for 15 long years finally extinguished, leaving behind a cool, undeniable peace. The war was officially over. The past was completely, thoroughly dead. I turned my back on the glass doors, refusing to spare her another second of my time. I walked smoothly across the lobby, the employees naturally parting to give me space, their faces filled with quiet, absolute respect. I stepped into the awaiting glass elevator, pressing the button for the executive floor. As the cab began its smooth ascent toward the top of my empire, I watched the heavy steel doors slide together, closing on the past forever. The heavy steel doors sealed shut, cutting off the echo of Beatrice's wails. That was the last time I ever saw her face in my building. The descent to the ground floor was smooth, silent, and absolute. The war was over. I had won. Fast forward exactly 1 year. Thanksgiving Day. The afternoon sun streamed through the massive bay windows of the dining room. It was the exact same room where I had once sat in suffocating silence, enduring Beatrice's relentless insults while choking down dry, tasteless meals. But the dark, oppressive mahogany panels were gone. The heavy velvet drapes that used to block out the light had been torn down and incinerated. In their place, the room was now an expanse of bright, airy elegance, filled with natural light, warm oak accents, and the rich, inviting aroma of roasted turkey sage and caramelized apples. The air did not smell like stale perfection and anxiety anymore. It smelled like home. I stood at the head of the long dining table, expertly carving the golden brown turkey. Laughter bounced off the walls, genuine and loud, replacing the stiff, calculated silence that used to govern this space. Sitting to my right was Leo. He was not the anxious, withdrawn boy who used to shrink into his chair to avoid his grandmother's critical gaze. He was sitting tall, his face glowing with a vibrant, unshakable confidence. He reached across the table, sliding a thick stack of pristine, embossed envelopes toward the guests sitting opposite him. They were college acceptance letters, not just one, but 4, including 2 Ivy League institutions. He had earned every single one of them on his own merit without a single phone call bribe or string pulled by a toxic family trust. Derek and Jasmine leaned over the table eagerly inspecting the letters. They were glowing, both looking healthier and happier than they ever had during their tenure under Beatrice's tyrannical rule. Derek let out a loud whoop of excitement, reaching across the spread of cranberry sauce and mashed potatoes to give Leo a massive high five. Jasmine beamed, her eyes shining with genuine pride as she poured another round of sparkling cider for Leo and rich Pinot Noir for the adults. This was my family. We were not bound by toxic bloodlines, conditional inheritances, or manipulative trusts. We were a family built entirely on loyalty, respect, and the absolute truth. Derek and Jasmine had stood by me when I had nothing but a plan, and now they were reaping the rewards of their unwavering loyalty, secure in their high-level executive positions within my company. Leo was thriving entirely free from the shadows of his father's failures and his grandmother's suffocating control. We were safe. If this moment were projected on a cinematic screen, the visual would split right down the middle, showcasing the absolute undeniable contrast of consequence. Across the city, far from the manicured lawns and gated driveways of their former life, sat a dingy, cramped motel room. The walls were stained with years of neglect, the peeling floral wallpaper curling at the damp edges. The only light came from a flickering grease-coated fluorescent bulb on the ceiling and the harsh glare of a broken neon sign blinking outside the single grimy window. Cockroaches scurried shamelessly along the cracked baseboards, disappearing into the frayed edges of the damp, heavily stained carpet. Beatrice sat perfectly rigid on the edge of a sagging, spring-worn mattress. She was wearing a faded, oversized sweater that swallowed her gaunt frame. The aristocratic pride that had once defined her every movement was entirely eradicated. Her hair, once perfectly styled and colored every 2 weeks, was now a brittle, unkempt mess of stark gray. She stared blankly at the peeling wall, her eyes hollow, completely devoid of the malicious spark that used to terrify everyone around her. Sitting across from her on a cheap plastic chair was Colin. He was wearing a polyester fast food uniform. The fabric was shiny with cheap grease, smelling permanently of old frying oil and despair. His crooked plastic name tag hung loosely from his chest. The trust fund boy, the heir apparent, who had never worked a single honest day in his entire privileged life, was now working the drive-through window on Thanksgiving Day just to survive. Resting on the scratched, wobbly laminate table between them was their holiday meal. It was a cardboard bucket of cold, cheap fried chicken and a paper bag of soggy French fries. They ate in absolute crushing silence. There was no conversation. There was no scheming. There was no future left to discuss. The reality of their destitution had finally broken them both. Taped carelessly to the thin, hollow wooden door of their room was a piece of bright neon pink paper. The bold black letters stamped across the top were impossible to ignore. Final eviction notice. They had exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises. They had no offshore accounts to tap into. They had no wealthy friends left to call. Every single person they had ever stepped on, used or abused, had gleefully turned their backs on them. They had absolutely nowhere left to go. The cage Beatrice had once built for me was now the very trap she was locked inside, and I had permanently thrown away the key. Back at the mansion, the fire crackled warmly in the grand stone hearth. The sound of clinking silverware and Leo's vibrant laughter anchored me completely in the present. I set down the carving knife and wiped my hands on a crisp linen napkin. I reached for my crystal wine glass, the deep red liquid catching the golden light of the afternoon sun. I looked directly forward, feeling the absolute, unshakable peace that only comes from fighting a war and winning on your own terms. I raised the glass slightly, offering a toast to the empty air, to the past, and to the absolute certainty of my future. They say family is everything, I said softly, a genuine, serene smile spreading across my face as I took a slow, savoring sip of the rich wine. But sometimes the most beautiful thing you can do for your family is taking out the trash. Happy Thanksgiving. The most powerful lesson from this story is that true family is defined by loyalty and mutual respect, never by toxic bloodlines or wealth. Her journey proves that the ultimate response to profound betrayal is not immediate chaotic anger, but silent, calculated resilience. When cornered by abuse, she used that deep trauma to methodically build her own impenetrable strength. Arrogance and cruelty inevitably orchestrate their own downfall, leaving the abusers with nothing. Ultimately, true vindication is found in protecting those you love and creating a thriving, authentic life where toxic individuals no longer have the power to define your worth.